Hello YouTube, welcome back. Well, it's the 18th of March 2025, about a week after the last of the big rains happened and the tail end of Cyclone Alfred swept through the northern rivers. And one of the first things I'm doing on my arrival back here to do lots of cleanup work, or so I think, is to do a little bit of a roll call around the macadamia growing region here in the northern rivers and to see what signs have been left by the tropical cyclone. And I thought I'd start logically from the coast and work my way inland. Here at the what I believe is the Dory's farm down at Knockrow, very close to the sea, which is over in that direction there. We're at Newrybar Swamp Road, and the farm I'm looking at here, honestly, what cyclone? I can't see a sign of it. I've brought you here a few times before if you're a long-term subscriber, and I noted that this particular season they'd done something new, and that was carved drainage channels in the middle of every single row, which is a little bit high maintenance, but just by the look of this, the channels are dry. They've clearly done their job, and we've had, bear in mind, nearly 600 mils of rain so far in March. I'm walking on really pretty solid ground. There've been a few warm days, but not overly sunny ones since the rain stopped. And as a post-cyclone performance, it's very impressive. I cannot see a single fallen limb. These trees would be possibly 7, perhaps 6 years old. You can't tell without asking the farmer. But I don't see any casualties at all. And interestingly, the other farmer I know who has trees down by the ocean, or near the ocean at Dungaruba, obviously Mel and Ron Katchenega, they've suffered damage, but it wasn't to their former sugarcane land farm like this is. That farm did very well, and they credit the success with staking, which is what the Dorys here pioneered. And as you can see, there's stakes on every single tree. They reckon that was responsible for saving a lot of the trees at Dungaruba, but they also say that really it didn't cop much of a lashing from the wind, or at least not as much as they were expecting. I would have thought close to the ocean, sea level, you're the first thing that the cyclone hits when it reaches landfall. But these trees just aren't showing the signs of it at all. They're bolt upright. None of them have even been bent over, which can happen in soggy soil. You can get a tree that'll sort of bend over at its roots and get a little bit twisted over by the wind. But these stakes that they've used are quite solid. They're quite thick hardwood stakes. And either they've done the job or this area just didn't get that hard hit. And the drainage channels, I mean, I can see from here, without sort of going past the nature strip on the road, those drainage channels are dry. So particularly well done to the people in this farm. They've dodged the literal bullet, and they've come out on top. Let's go further inland and see if the picture continues there. Now, the Alstonville Plateau mini geography lesson is the first real raised area of land in from the coastline in terms of growing macadamias in the northern rivers. And I'm in Lindendale at the moment, looking at a farm, and you can see some branches down. I think they've been gathered and brought up to the ends of rows so that they don't all come from these little trees that have obviously been planted more recently by the side of the road. We're not talking major damage. I'm not seeing trees capsized over or anything like that. But obviously there are some branches down, and there's been a bit of an orchard cleanup. Farmers are keen to clean up their orchards, of course, because it's getting close to, if not for some varieties, in the middle of harvest time. Across the road I can see another farm over there that's in actually very good condition. So if it's had any damage, it's been cleaned up. And things here, you know, and I've driven past other farms obviously on my way here, and I've seen definitely some fallen branches, and I've seen a pecan orchard with some very big branches down. So I suspect the wind hit this area a little bit harder than it did closer to the coast, but we'll keep exploring and see what else we can find. I've come across this fairly ugly sight by the side of the road here in Tregeagle. And look, Connor Road is a little bit of a royalty as far as macadamia farms go. There's some very serious farmers doing great things, and when they have storm damage, you would expect them to do exactly what they've done here. This is bring out all the fallen limbs from within the orchard, plonk them by the side of the road, and they're either going to be chipped up by a chipping contractor. I don't think you're going to burn them. You wouldn't do a burn pile by the side of the road, or you can get a forestry mulcher to sort of crunch them down into some fairly rough mulch. But you can see there's a tree that's lost a large limb, and we've got quite a lot of debris from within the orchard. Now, it looks dramatic, but if that's all there is from a very large orchard, it's still not that heavy damage in terms of the overall tree numbers and the overall crop that you might have lost off the tree. So, look, it's not nice to see, but it's not terrible either. Over here, you could see what I was referring to earlier in terms of potential damage to young trees. These babies here are in a sort of unsheltered corridor between two groves of large trees, and that lack of shelter has led to them, if you can see the angle properly, they've been literally blown over. And yeah, they're youngish trees, again, probably no more than a few years old. There's some other young trees in amongst the larger trees that didn't suffer any damage at all, but these exposed ones were just blown over. Now, you might be asking, are these trees rescuable? Look, I think they are. Some people try and straighten them up and stake them, but I know from what Peter Fraser's said is that, you know, once you hear a crack when trying to straighten up, if you hear a crack, that's the taproot breaking and you've lost the tree. Trees do tend to find their way up towards the sun eventually, but they'll grow up with a little bit of a crooked trunk if they leave them there. Some farmers would prefer to just have them out and start again. Don't know what this farmer's going to do, but it's a fairly obvious example of which way the wind was blowing when the worst of the wind hit these areas. And we had this phenomenon with what was effectively an ex-tropical cyclone, where we got a lot of rain first. And that is dangerous when you get a lot of rain first, because it softens the soil, and it means that when the wind does come, the trees are much more susceptible to being blown over in muddy soil than they would be in firm dry soil when you get the wind and rain hitting at the same time for the first time. So yeah, that's an example of trees that weren't staked, which is really in most climates, most of them. So from Tregeagle, I've gone through Lismore, up through Modenville, and all the way to Dunoon. And Dunoon is on a ridge above the sort of Alstonville Plateau area. And before you start heading out west to the great big beyond, Dunoon, which claims to be Australia's macadamia capital. What can we see here? Well, there's not heaps of damage, and on the way up I looked at several farms and there really wasn't huge signs of damage in any of them. There certainly has been some wind through. There's a limb down over there in a distant tree, and there've clearly been limbs down in the orchard, I'd suspect, because through the trees there you can see one massive pile of wood chip. And so this particular orchard has been very proactive and got on top of chipping the kind of branches I showed you a little earlier on in the episode. So what you see now is really, I suppose, the aftermath. But the windbreak that you see here that was originally planted to shield the young macadamia trees didn't do so well. Eucalyptus trees are notorious for snapping and falling over, and this one is an absolute beauty. Obviously took down a road sign with it, and plenty of limbs off the trees that are still standing. So you can tell the storm's been through here, but you know, the macadamia trees I'm looking at on average are fairly resilient. it's yeah, they'll have lost some branches and they'll have lost a bit of crop. Whether it blew off nuts or anything, we're not gonna find out now. It'll come in the crop stats when we start tallying up the crop that farmers can actually harvest. But yeah, it is interesting. Certainly relative to a eucalyptus tree, a macadamia tree seems reasonably strong. Now, Dunoon is about as far west as I went on my explorations. I could have gone all the way out to near Kyogle, where Matty Kelby has his farm, but not on this particular trip. And I hear from Matty that his farm hasn't suffered any major damage. They had a lot of rain out there, but the wind, I gather, can't have been strong enough to bowl his trees over, and he's still a relatively happy camper. But I did want to go to one of the older, taller orchards around the place, because I had this theory that, in a way, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. And I wasn't wrong. I'm going to try and show you through the very thick canopy of these old trees in Eureka what I mean. I did see some of the boughs driving across the road. Inside this orchard, there are some very large fallen limbs off trees. They're a little bit difficult to see, and they won't be easy for you to see from home unless you've got a fairly big screen. But this is an orchard that hasn't had any cleanup done, and I just noticed, yeah, as driving past, there were some very large branches. I don't think they were whole trees that were falling over, but it wasn't a pretty sight for some of what I saw. It's making a liar out of me, but if you see, yeah, looking through those trees there, I can see several branches down in the rows, off in the distance. So not just affecting the ones at the edge of the block, which you think would be the most exposed to wind, it's affecting trees right through an orchard. And there's a bit more of what I'm talking about there through those trees. You can see a fair bit of vegetation down right in the centre of the row. Large branches cutting off the trees. So, is that catastrophic? Well, for an orchard like this, I'd argue no, it's not. When I talked to Bruce Chester saying, listen, I'm really scared about what I'm going to find on my farm, he comforted me and said, Daniel, it's nature's pruning. And when you do shed a big bough off a tree that is in a fairly overcrowded orchard, you know, this one you can see here doesn't have much ground cover on. I do think, you know, when you've got large trees, particularly if they're the variety 246 or the descendants of 246, they do tend to self-prune this way quite often. There are certain varieties of tree that will do that more regularly. Yeah, the old wisdom was the 246 self-pruned a lot. They brought in the 344 because it was a stronger tree. But sometimes what you found with the 344, instead of losing limbs, you'd lose the entire tree because the whole thing would topple over. Yeah, so look, there's some fairly substantial damage, but obviously once the effort's made to clean it out, chip it, there's going to be more like getting into the canopy where those branches came off. It's not as organised as human pruning, of course, but in a long-term sense, it shouldn't be anything to worry about. Now, I've long admired this particular farm on Gormans Road, Eureka, and I've brought you to see it a couple of times in my earlier episodes. This is a farm that was rehabilitated partly by pruning back existing old trees to make them a reasonable size, but also removing 2 rows of the old trees and planting one in the middle where that happened. And that hasn't worked out so well in this particular storm. Here's the new row of trees that was planted in the middle of the older rows. It could have been a function of which way the wind was blowing at the time the storm hit, but there's at least a few whole trees that have been lost in this new row, and the other trees are leaning over badly. It's quite a big blow for the rehab effort, which is otherwise a very, very clever thing to do. But this particular farmer got bad luck, and had the wind been blowing across the rows instead of down them, I don't think there'd have been an issue. But as you can see, the wind was clearly coming up the rows because the trees are leaning up towards the roadway where I'm filming from. And what a sad sight to see. And it's duplicated down the other rows as well where those trees have been planted. Quite a sad loss for those. Will the trees recover? Yeah, I think so. They might have a bit of a lean, but they can straighten up a little bit in their new growth. They won't be the most perfect example of tall upright trees if they're left there. But again, the lost trees can be replanted. There'll be enough sunlight for new trees to grow. So yeah, sad to see. So if you've held on this long, you're probably thinking, well, geez, you're showing us everybody else's farm, Daniel. What about your one? How did your farm cope? And so here we are back at Nutkin Farm, and at least now I can show you some damage from actually within the orchard rather than hanging around the roadside. And there's been some damage. Rosebank's always been a little bit nestled from most storms, in that around my farm in that area there's hills pretty much covering every direction the wind could blow. But there was some very strong winds and very heavy rains in this particular tropical storm, and there were some casualties. Not many whole trees, I'm led to believe, by the people who live here more than I do. But here's an example of a tree that's had a real nature's pruning. It's lost the major part of the tree. There are still some limbs there. That's a tree that I'd be fairly confident will grow back. That's the part of the tree that was lost, which is, of course, most of the foliage, probably all the nuts that were there. What's happened, of course, is that it's opened up a canopy and there's light hitting the ground where it was, in fact, quite dark before, and you can see in general most of the row is dark. And along that particular row, which is one of my longer sort of stretches, there's no other damage in that particular row. It seems like the exposed trees near the edges of the block probably suffered the most damage. We had quite a large limb come down off this particular tree here near the entrance to the farm. I'll show it to you up close. Here's a tree that, in fact, there's a few of these trees in my orchard where you've got effectively an early forking of the tree. So it forked out early in its life and no one trimmed it back to a central leader and ended up developing 2 leaders. So what's happened here is that one of those forks has effectively come down. I don't think the remaining half of that tree is going to stay viable, so we may have to actually cut off the branch at the base of the fork. And that's sort of what macadamia wood looks like close up. Now, you could tell that branch was weak because there's almost some rooting material coming through the top part of that branch, suggesting that there was some rot or weakness or something further up the tree. And of course we're left here with quite a big chunk of wood. And as I've discovered from hauling fallen branches around before, macadamia wood is exceptionally heavy. I don't know if you call it hardwood as such. Maybe it isn't a hardwood, but if it's not, it's certainly a solid wood in the sense that it's possibly filled with macadamia oil or something, in any case, that makes the branches quite heavy to remove. And there's a few other branches down around the place. But again, nothing more than what I've seen around Eureka and the sort of similar areas. So out of all of them, I think it's the plateaus. It's the Alstonville Plateau and also around here, the Eureka Plateau, that have probably copped more damage than the coastal districts when it comes to the wind damage from this particular storm. Is that every storm? No. There's some storms that hit in different ways and definitely from different directions depending on the time of the year. Tropical Cyclone Alfred, or the remnants of it, hard to tell what direction it really comes from when it does the damage, because cyclones can come from multiple directions depending on which sort of arm of the cyclone is coming through your property. So we have a few broken limbs that are still up in the trees. Not sure how we necessarily get them down. May well be sort of a pruning exercise that we do after we sort of pick up whatever nuts we can pick up, and then it would be dealt with as part of pruning. Yeah, that particular cut that you see in the halfway up the tree there is almost exactly the kind of cut you'd make if you were pruning that particular tree, because it's opened up the canopy, it's exposed light inside the tree. It's actually a good thing. It's just not a controlled thing. So there's the damage report for Tropical Cyclone Alfred. That's the informal one, and obviously I've been not all over the northern rivers making this video for you, but I've been through a reasonable amount of the main growing districts. Some of you may have fared worse or better, even in the same area that I filmed in. And again, the important message from the AMS and also a couple of nut processors are encouraging their farmers to do it now. I got an email from Wally's Nuts saying, look, go fill in the damage report on the New South Wales Department of Primary Industry site. We need statistics of damage. We need photos of the damage so that the New South Wales DPI can reach a conclusion that macadamia farmers might need a little bit of help in dealing with the effects of this disaster. So when it comes to disaster relief, being stoic is not a virtue. You've really got to sort of report your damage. Otherwise, people will just assume that nothing's wrong. And so I'll be doing a little bit of homework with some photographs and things like that, and probably getting my tractor and a tow chain out, trying to get some of these branches into a recoverable position where we can do something. All right, so the work's ahead of me. Thanks for tuning in, guys. I will be back again soon. I'm hoping to speak to a much more experienced macadamia farmer on what cyclones have done to our area before, and how farms tend to recover from them, because that's wisdom that some of us would very much like to hear, including me. But until then, stay safe, stay dry, and enjoy whatever it is you do. Bye for now.